for myself, I find that the further I go with this, the more I realize that I am very much dependent upon, if I'm speaking, upon the group itself and upon the support and the insight and the perspective that we're carrying here together. So what I'd like to invite us to do as we begin is just to spend a few minutes in silence, and during this time I would ask for two things. One is to just sort of to silently within your own heart think about what brings you here tonight and your connection to the topic at hand, and to this connection between interior transformation and transformation in the world or social change. And also I would ask, in whatever tradition you come from and in whatever way feels appropriate, for your prayers and for your blessings that what I share may be of some use and some service in this process, and I do rely on those for support. So, we'll take just a couple minutes and I'll mark the end of that time. May our hearts and our minds remain open to the fullness of life as we continue our time here together. Just one quick question as we begin. We are doing a recording of this talk. If there's anyone that does not feel comfortable having something that they're sharing recorded as we move into the question time, we can certainly turn the tape off. So simply make I'll leave that as something that can make a positive motion for if there's something you'd like to share, but I don't want you to feel like you're obligated to have anything recorded here. So as I was thinking about this talk tonight, and I feel both honored and humbled to be sharing, as I look around, there's a great deal of wisdom in the circle around this topic, and people that have spent decades working on cultivating both interior and outer social transformation in our community. A few things that came to my mind around the central theme, as Simon had mentioned, is it's beginning to emerge in the center that lasting social change comes first from a change of consciousness. That the interior change and interior transformation leads to the manifestation of the lasting exterior change. And there are a few things that I've heard and that I've gained from the circle that have become clear that I just want to mention first, that have emerged as sort of a platform for everybody to speak. One is that we've articulated this and realized that this is true both for our individual lives and also for the life of the world. So that's a dynamic that happens individually, that before things begin to change in the outer life, there's a change of heart, a transformation of the heart, or an awakening of the heart. And that also that happens on a social level, that there's interior change, and then there's a building up of a level of trust and collaboration between individuals before an organization is able to make a truly effective impact on the wider world, or at least according to the intention that the group has. There's plenty of impacts that can be made out of discord, of course. And that another thing that we've come together around, or that people that have been a part of the conversation have shared, is that the role of the activist in facing the many very complex and very deep difficulties in the world can easily come to a place of feeling overwhelmed and feeling burnt out without a spiritual center, or without a place to connect to that's deeper than, or that's greater than our ordinary waking consciousness and the resources that come from that. So that there's a necessity to go deeper for the activist. And the flip side of that, I would say, that we've also learned is that for the person that is coming to this conversation from a more spiritual perspective, that one's interior spiritual journey cannot continue beyond a certain point unless it spills out or flows out into service of the world. That is, at some point, it can't just be about ourselves if it's going to be true. So there's an intersection and interdependence there between action and contemplation, or action and an interior practice. And along with that, one of the gifts of starting with an interchange is an ongoing purification of the motivation for our activism. I'll just use an example in my own life that I was very involved in environmental activism early on in high school, into college, and I was also began sometime after college to be involved a little more with some reform and renewal movements in the Catholic Church. And one time I had a friend who's a Marist brother, a religious brother, and I was talking about all the different things I was working on and challenged with, and he knows some of my history and my background around my family dynamics and family relations, and just looked at me and said, "Wow, Mark, you're spending a lot of time trying to take care of Mother Church and Mother Earth." and he called me exactly on where that motivation was coming from, of an earlier caretaking dynamic in my family role. So sometimes our spiritual practice also pushes us to question what's motivating us to do the work that we're doing, and then to go deeper. am I doing this service really, really out of the goodness of my heart, or is there some way, that I'm doing this to feel good about myself or see myself in a certain light? So it can be very humbling, part of this process, but there's a purification of our motivation. And also, I would say that another gift is that we begin to see that the microcosm is the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is the microcosm, meaning that our interior life and the life of the world aren't separate from one another. That what we experience within our heart and what we see out in the world are so tied together that we can't actually separate them between inner and outer, and that the same work is going on. If we're forgiving someone else, we're also working on forgiving a certain dynamic within ourselves. If we're working to change and bring justice out there, we're also addressing some level of injustice within our own hearts or within our own communities. So, and then finally, that goes along with that is the realization that I think we've come to, taking this idea seriously, is that we don't actually have human enemies. It's a very liberating thing in the work of trying to bring about change and justice in the world, that we're all in this together, and what we're fighting against, if fighting is even a helpful term, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, are forces. We're fighting against greed, we're fighting against evil, we're fighting against oppression, and that the way to address those is not to hate the person, because that actually fuels the very forces that have created the discord, but to, and we'll get into this later, but to be present with them with love and with compassion and with forgiveness, and that's something that can be transformative, both applied to ourselves and to the outside world. So there's a real liberation that comes when we've collectively taken this stance seriously. A quote from Henry David Thoreau comes to mind. He says that for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, there is one striking at the root. And I think that's a question that we've taken seriously here, is how do we strike at the root of the problems that we see in our world and the discord that we see in our world, that we deeply desire to do something to bring positive change to. So tonight we're going to go for the root, and this is one approach or one angle that has been helpful for me. I'm very much a beginner in this process. There's a lot, it's a very big topic, there's a lot that I don't understand, and there's a lot that I thought I understood a few years ago that I'm less certain about now. So we'll keep that in mind as we're sharing. One of the things that's common in my interest, and I think in our community's interest, about exploring the relationship of spiritual practice to outer change is two forms or two approaches to spiritual practice. One of them being what I like to call an ascent spirituality. And what I mean by an ascent spirituality is that the emphasis is on the transcendent aspect of who we are. We might consider this the work of the spirit, of that part that is infinite, that is eternal, the place where we are already connected to God, to the infinite, to vast spaciousness, the part that was never born, that never dies. There's different ways of referring to it in different traditions. It has an aspect of the yang in the Taoist kind of yin-yang. It has an aspect of the masculine. Doesn't mean it's necessarily male, but an aspect of the masculine relates to consciousness and a sense of purity, perhaps a sense of divinity. And if we're to place it on the landscape, and my background in the outdoors, I often like to think of these landscape imagery. This would be the mountaintop perspective. The spirituality where we stand up high, or we're lifted up, and we see the whole vast plain laid out before us. And there's a tremendous power in connecting to that bigness, that vastness, that gives us perspective, that gives us strength, that gives us balance in doing the work of social change, for example. And then there's another form of spirituality that's complementary, and I think both are absolutely necessary for us to do this work effectively. And that's what I would call the descent spirituality. So the descent spirituality, the emphasis is not so much on transcendence, but on the immanence, that which is present right here, right now, in front of us. The emphasis is on soul work as opposed to spirit. Spirit being the part of ourselves that's connected to the infinite, soul being our particular uniqueness, our specific, me, Mark, or David, or Leah, or Dhamma, we have a specific soul. The soul is always specific. Might have an aspect of the yin in the Taoist yin-yang distinction, or an aspect of the feminine, once again not just female, but the feminine side of things. And instead of consciousness, the central term we might use thinking about this might be the word heart, which doesn't just mean emotions, but the heart of our being, the very center of who we are, or our sort of essence, but in a personal way. And in contrast to purity and divinity, this is the part that is, almost by its nature, wounded and broken and limited and earthy, and tied into the earth, which bears woundedness and brokenness and limitations and boundedness by definition. And if we're to place that on the landscape, to contrast with the mountaintop spirituality, that might be the river bottom spirituality, the muck, the depths, the places that are under the water, that are down in the deep, the places we don't normally see, we don't normally look at, and we don't necessarily choose to strive to look at either. So another way of thinking of this to shift images is if we think of the ocean, that ascent spirituality, or the transcendent aspect, might be the depths of the ocean, and this immanent aspect might be the waves on the top of the surface, crashing around, the dynamic movement, and the changing nature. And if we hold on to one and not the other, we're not whole, and we miss part of the picture. So if we only identify with the immanent, soulful, particular, earthy, wounded, often aspect of ourself, that we can often be so caught up in the moment and sort of overwhelmed with the aspects of the moment that there's an inherent lack of perspective and lack of expansiveness that can be very limiting. And similarly, if we focus on the ascent spirituality only and identify with that, we can cut off that emotional side of our being, and we can cut off access to the ability to respond appropriately to the present moment. And something we'll get into in a little bit, when we sometimes the ascent spirituality can be hijacked by the part of our ego, or the part of our self that wants to stay safe and protected and that doesn't want to be vulnerable, and can use the transcendent as a excuse to not engage with the painful parts of being human and being embodied and being incarnate, which always involves suffering on some level. So there's a danger in doing one without the other. So we're gonna keep that in mind, but we're gonna be focusing at first primarily on this aspect of the descent. And so our focus tonight is the phrase I've used is vulnerability, unconditional happiness, and radical social change. And from this perspective of the descent spirituality, I think we have to begin with vulnerability. I don't like doing that. It's scary, it's uncomfortable, and yet it's necessary. So I would define vulnerability for the context of our talk as an open-hearted, unguarded, full embrace of life and reality as it comes to us in every moment. which means, another way of saying it is sort of courageously showing up for our date life. Life is there at the door waiting for us. Do we show up? Do we bring our whole selves present? Or not? And that requires a great vulnerability. And the scary part about it, the vulnerability, is that we don't get to choose what we welcome in necessarily. This is where vulnerability is difficult, because it seems to me, after years of looking at this and experiencing it for myself and hearing for others, that we can be open to life and to love and to sorrow and to sadness and to brokenheartedness. Or we can be closed to those things, but we don't have the option of choosing that we're going to be open to love and to joy and to peace and to connection, and then close off the part that is painful, that is sorrowful, that is limited, that is mourning. It's a single door, it's a single gateway. And so the question is, are we open? Is that gateway open or is it not? Or to what degree is it open or not? And I don't know anyone, and certainly not myself. I'm not able to keep that door open all the time, but that's the question. That's the question of vulnerability. So it relates very much to courage, and the courage to be present and to be open. And if we close our heart, as I mentioned, we close our heart to any one emotion, it closes us to access to all emotions and to our vitality. If we close it to any one person, that ends up also closing the door to any other people, because on the level of the soul, it's just, am I going to be in relationship with others or not? So when we close our heart to another, we end up to a certain degree closing our heart to all others, not completely, but when we each time we open our heart in forgiveness to one other, we open our heart to relationship to all people. And the same thing is true for our relationship with nature, relationship with ourselves, our relationship to God, our relationship to the transcendent, and also our relationship to other people. And that opening our heart and keeping our heart open to any one of those things will keep our heart open to all of the others. A beautiful example of this that I recently heard was very hardened criminals, multiple murder arrests, who are locked up in solitary confinement, just have been so burned by life that they can't trust anyone. They've had success working with these men with therapy animals, with dogs and with horses, that they learn how to trust an animal first. And in having that trust, there's a softening of the heart, and it over time gradually leads to a reintegration and a capacity to relate with other human beings. That's a great example of that. Another example, just in my own life, as many of you know, I work in the outdoors now as a part of my profession, and much more than my profession, as part of my love and my life's calling. And that orientation came about when I had joined a monastic community, and I was living there for a year as a hermit. And I was spending about 4 hours a day in silent prayer practice or silent meditation. And I really hadn't looked much or paid much attention to that. I mean, I admired the outdoors, but it was something I always it was a visual thing, something I was aesthetically pleased with, and it was only in spending hours and hours opening to my own heart and opening to the heart of God that one day I woke up with this incredibly painful ache of feeling cut off from the natural world. Nothing had changed, but I realized that I was not in relationship with it. I didn't know any of the trees around me. I didn't know any of the animals. I didn't know their names. I didn't have a sense of them as living beings. We weren't connected. And it suddenly became unbearably painful. And I think it's this: my heart was open enough in other realms that it just naturally began to spill out into the one of those four of self, God, nature and others. It was the one that I had not cultivated, and it broke open, and that has become, for about a decade, it was a central place of growth and relation in my life, and continues to be. So to be vulnerable, and to be open to love means also to be vulnerable to suffering. And I think that's the place where we naturally tend to block off and to not want to go there, very naturally. So one of the great archetypes of, well, let me step back. One of the great archetypes of spiritual transcendence that we have, or one of the great images, icons that we have, a couple of images around here is right behind the pot. There's an image of the Buddha, often sitting in the lotus position. There we go. And sometimes my favorite. Thank you, David. It's a great example there. At one with all things, at peace, having transcended all suffering. Some of the best images, I think, are the golden Buddhas that we see in Thailand and Southeast Asia, where the whole body of the Buddha is gold and is just radiant. So this perfect image of that fullness of human potential and the transcendent. And fittingly, it's one of the most well-known images that we carry around in our shared religious consciousness. Now the other one is, of course, the image of Christ on the cross. His arms outstretched, nails going through his wrists, nails going through his feet, bleeding to death, or not, bleeding and dying. Arms totally out in a wide open embrace, completely immersed in suffering. And to me, that's the great image of this vulnerability, of this immanent spirituality, and that the two are complementary, that the two represent these two different aspects of a fully human life, a fully human experience. And I'll pick on my own tradition because I'm allowed to do that from the inside. One of the great sadnesses with modern Christianity is that, for the most part, not all, but many of us have turned the image of the cross, which is the ultimate image of human vulnerability, of the divine human being giving everything, resisting nothing, taking all of life in, and turned it into a way to make us not vulnerable, to say that I am on the right team, I am saved, I am protected, I don't have to go through the sufferings of life because I have obtained the special status through the theological term is substitutionary atonement. Jesus suffered and died, so I don't have to. Great misunderstanding of that spiritual image. And so the original message behind that image, I think, is that the true freedom comes on the far side of being broken open by life and love, not by going around it or avoiding those things. And I think there's a danger that I found for myself in spiritual practices, that when I have a great experience of transcendence, or of the part within me that is beyond suffering, which we all have and is part of our collective shared inheritance as spiritual beings. And there's a sitting in that part of ourself that doesn't die, that is never born, that is never lost, that is emptiness itself, or the fullness and empty simultaneously, that is incredibly healing and liberating and brings about a deep peace. But it does not mean that we don't have the experience of living in a body and of suffering and of having loss. So where I find the temptation is to take that experience and then turn it into a reason to say, okay, now I don't have to face life anymore, or that I'm somehow set free from these experiences of the suffering, of loving, of losing, of connecting and bonding. So there's a paradox there. There's a danger that we can, when we're doing spiritual practice, we can use spirituality as a way to get out of life rather than a way to fully enter and move through, and to experience that transcendence alongside the immanent presence of the divine. So, to be fully human, to be fully alive, and to be free, the teaching is that we must face our fear, we must face our pain, we must face our shadows, we must face our brokenness, our continual resistance, and that we must carry love and presence into these realms. It's not that we have love here and then we have the sorrow and the suffering over here. The love has to be brought into those realms for there to be healing and liberation. Older cultures knew this really well. It's the basis for initiation rites and rites of passage in many cultures, is that to teach the young adults very early on the necessity of going downward, of being broken open, of being wounded in order to become whole, or of accepting the woundedness in life in order to become whole. And that's something, there are a few folks here that have been with me in some of our retreat programs. It's something we try to do with the new creation trips, is to have a period of time where we intentionally face the wounds, and we'll go off to be alone with the earth, with nature, and to be with the suffering. And it doesn't work to go to, in my experience, it doesn't work to go to the images of sort of spiritual awakening before opening to the process of stripping down and of letting go and of going into the depths. The two are very closely tied together. So there needs to be a falling apart of an old way of being in the world, and then a sitting in an unknowing and allowing the new reality to emerge. It seems to be the sequence. Not that it has to happen always that way, but it seems to be the normal sequence of things. Very un-American. So, at this point, I'd like to shift to a period. Maybe we'll turn the recorder off for this. So just asking a question, and then we'll turn to a partner or to a group of three as needed, and just think about the question. The question I'd like to ask comes from a quote. The quote is, "Be kind to others, for everyone you know is facing a great battle." Relates to this vulnerability. And the question is, what great battle are you facing? And to share something of that, if we're able to, with one another in pairs. And the person who's listening, I invite you just to receive that with presence. We don't need to fix anything, we don't need to change anything, just to listen and hear that. And we'll take about a minute either way on each side. So, if vulnerability, if this capacity to be fully open to life is so central to our ability to be whole, to be fully human, and we can already think a little bit about what that would mean for our collective world, for our social world. To be fully present and fully human. What keeps us from being vulnerable? Question. So I'd like to spend a little time now touching upon that. So again, a topic that we could spend a whole week on, exploring the details. But life itself is whole, radiant, and beautiful to all who perceive it clearly. It's one of the consistent reports from the great liberated beings and enlightened beings is that reality itself is, maybe we could just leave it at that, is. But there's a wholeness, there's a beauty, there's a loveliness, there's a radiance, there's a goodness at its core. And yet there's also a universal experience of lack, of something missing, of dissatisfaction, of misalignment, of pain, of something being wrong. The term, one term that relates to this, I'm sure there are many different nuances, but like one term in Buddhism is the term dukkha, the sense of just inherent dissatisfaction with life. In my tradition, in the Christian tradition, an old way of speaking about was the phrase original sin, which has been degraded and sometimes to just mean, you're bad right from the beginning. That's not the sense of it. The sense of that is that it means that before we even had a chance, before we came into full consciousness, there was already a sense of being out of alignment or misalignment, which you did nothing yourself to create. But we all have to deal with. We're all kind of stuck in that mess together. The more contemporary phrase that contemplative teachers in my tradition use is the human condition. This is the condition we all find ourselves in. So it's not personal. And it's interesting that classic spirituality, both in the East and the West, world mythology, and also contemporary psychology, all are in agreement about this universal sense of misalignment, or there's something wrong. My sense, in both my experience and the teaching in my tradition, is that there's, our goodness, our original wholeness is deeper than that. The original blessing is deeper than the original sin, to use those terms. And the word sin, in its origins, simply means missing the mark. It comes from archery. It means somebody shooting off the mark. It doesn't necessarily mean one is bad. And my sense is that we come into the world needing and expecting, this is where it gets into this immanent and transcendent, we come into the world expecting and needing incarnate, unconditional love, the fullness of embrace and welcome of love that is in form from people, particularly from our parents and from our community and from our world. And that's what, when you look in the eyes of that radiant child, a radiant child, which all children are when they come into the world, there's that glow. They're expecting to receive that. And we do our best, and the way the world is right now, and has been for as long as anyone can remember, we always fail. And some interesting studies in the intersection of spirituality and psychology seem to indicate that it's not until somewhere around the classic age of initiation, which itself is fascinating, but somewhere around 15 or 16, that a human being gains the full development of the intuitive faculties and the capacity in the brain to sort of fully abstract. And this is a little bit of a stretch, but I feel like it's onto something, the capacity to experience unconditional love from the source, from the infinite source of life itself. And so we have this gap, this period of about 15 years of our development where we are dependent upon others for love. And as an adult, we actually don't need to be loved in the same way as a child does. We need to love, and we need to be in alignment to love. But there are people that have lived incredibly psychologically healthy lives as hermits for decades at a time with access to infinite love. But there's a point where we need it and we don't get it. And there's an immense pain of not being fully met by love. And there's a learning to strategize that happens very early on, when we're still infants even, pre-verbal, of ways to get affection, to get attention, to get longing, to get belonging, to get a certain degree of power and autonomy and control, and to get our needs met, that we begin to develop. And so there's a very early formation of a personality that comes really around an initial wounding. And it's embarrassing to really look at this closely. That each of us, who we think we are, our persona is something that we've acquired, and we've acquired around a wound, what we might call a core wound. It's a theory of developmental psychology, that our sense of ourself, who we are separate from others, from the world, is developed around a wound and a compensatory strategy. For those of you who are familiar with the Enneagram, it's a personality typology system that identifies 9 core personality types, and the way that the personality types are understood is how somebody responded to that initial wounding. And so it's not just about saying this is the way we are, it's saying this is the place where our sense of separation from life and reality began to form and to consolidate. And we all have it, but we tend to have it in slightly different ways, so that what works for liberation for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person in the same outward form. So our basic sense of who we are in this world, coming through this developmental process, begins to be largely based around the fulfilling of emotional needs, which, of course, there are certain natural ones, but then when they're unmet, they begin to take on an increasingly desperate quality, and then at some point we sort of lose the ability to distinguish what's an actual need and what is the term that they're using in the peer counseling that I'm a part of is a frozen need, a need that can never be filled, because it's actually something that we were denied long ago. If we were never received enough attention from the parent of the opposite gender, we might be forever looking for attention from romantic partners, and it's never going to work from that place, because that's not where the initial wounding happened. Be one example, and a self begins to develop. The earlier contemplative teachers used to call this the false self. I like to use the term fabricated self, because it's not bad. We all do this, and it's a part of entering more fully into our individuation. We need to develop a self and an ego, but I like to use the term fabricated self, because it's homemade, it's built up from our experiences and our wounds, and there's an armoring that goes on. We might say that there's sort of 3 centers that this tends to happen around the need for power and control, the need for affection and esteem, and the need for security and survival. One way of slicing up the pie. Each of those, there's a basic human need, but again, when it's unmet, it becomes a center of motivation, and then can begin to expand to sort of dominating our thoughts and our desires, largely unconsciously, as we move through life. We tend to have one of those that's stronger than the others. For example, for myself, in the Enneagram profile, I'd be sort of an Enneagram 8, that I'm somebody that very early response to wounding, there was a sense of violation that I responded to by trying to become strong. And so, as a very little boy, I was always trying to be strong for other people and to kind of have my act together, even when I was very young. And when I look back, this is all completely unconscious. If I look back at the decisions that I would make, I was 5 years old, got a chance to play ice hockey, and I look around and everybody was playing, and there'd be a big pile of sticks in the center at our Learn to Skate program, and everybody would grab a stick, and I found the one stick that was bigger and wider than all the other ones, and I wanted that one. And that's how I ended up being a hockey goaltender, because I wanted the big stick. Or when I joined the orchestra, I had to play the double bass because it was the biggest instrument. I would stand out the most, be stronger. Or I was like be in the the most physical sports, or wanted to be, be a team captain, or I was going to be involved in spirituality. I want to be giving talks to be in the center of a room of 25 people, for example. Oh boy. So that's, so that realm becomes really comfortable for me and becomes a high motivation. Now for someone else, they might have found their security system centered around being invisible. And so it'd be the just opposite. It would be very hard for them to be here, but it would feel very safe for them to be in the background and not be seen. Whereas I would find that very difficult to do. So, so we get tied into these patterns. We could give endless examples. The last thing I want to say about that structure is that when we're talking about the process of becoming spiritually whole in order to enact effective change in the world, we have to be very careful, because when we start to make progress, we might begin to disidentify with some of the more obviously destructive aspects of one of these patterns. Say, like, I no longer, get in locker room fights with other hockey players, but there's a strong temptation to identify with some sort of spiritualized version of that self or that archetype. So I'd rather be a spiritual teacher and shoot down the arguments of other spiritual teachers and point out why they're inadequate. That would feel satisfying. Or if I were a person that got my identity from always giving to others, I might identify myself as the martyr archetype. Or if I had a strong sense of indignation and that I got my sense of identity from being right, another classic way this plays out, I might identify with the prophet archetype. I might be able to do a tremendous amount of good in the world in that, but we have to be careful that we're not just turning that into another way of fulfilling those emotional needs. But what happens in any of these systems, and we all have some version of this, is that the entire system is dualistic and binary, in that the world is divided up into good, the things that fulfill my programs for happiness, and evil, the thing that thwart my programs for happiness. And this is applied to individuals, to communities, to cultures, and to nations. You'll hear it on the news, just spouted out as clear as day. They'll talk about, or politicians talking about, building up American self-interest. Do we ever stop and listen to that? Like, what a strange concept. We're saying that the whole country is using the system. It's all about what's good for us or what's not good for us. And we do this as individuals too. So it puts us in quite a mess. Because there are 7 billion other people trying to do the same thing. And what are the odds of avoiding conflict if we're each operating out of one of these systems, or each of our communities are operating out of these systems? So, so we might say that this fabricated self is a very sophisticated system for attempting to extract conditional happiness from the world on its own terms. The statement would be, if only I get blank, I will be happy. That's the way that part of our self works. And most of the time, that's what's running the show. Certainly globally, that's what's running the show. Large percentage of humanity, that's what's running the show most of the time. None of us is completely dominated by it, none of us is completely free from it, but that tends to run things. And it can never work because it's not based on the actual reality and where actual happiness comes from. So we all inherit it. It's we might call it a first operating system. You need to build up some version of this to navigate childhood and to make it into a successful, operational, functional, somewhat neurotic adult. It's good. It's a good thing that we get here. Those that don't make it that don't build up that self sufficiently can't function in the world. And instead of having neurosis, they have psychosis. And so when the self isn't fully formed, that's not good. So it's necessary that this is built up, and we don't need to feel bad about it. It's the most common thing. You know, it's like everybody poops. You know, everybody has one of these fabricated cells. But it's actually an inherent, systematic way of avoiding vulnerability and avoiding the undifferentiated encounter with life. The whole system is designed to keep us safe, to keep us from being vulnerable. And we just went over sharing how being fully vulnerable and fully open to life is central to being fully human, and as we'll get to in a moment, is of course central to being able to open to the type of world that we're trying to build, or to build towards the healing of the world. So collectively, of course, this manifests differently in each culture. You know, Italian and Japanese cultures have a very different way of dealing with the issue of expression, whether or not that's seen as something highly encouraged or highly discouraged, as two examples. In our own culture, in American culture, of course, success, achievement, growth, and progress are the collective good, the collective thing that we see as safe and acceptable to move towards and to try and hang on to. Use the Enneagram system, it's the Enneagram 3. And so again, we want to be very careful when we look at spirituality, because an Americanized spirituality will tend to have an emphasis on individual salvation or individual progress. It will tend to have a focus on personal growth as opposed to the life of the community. It might, one form of it that we see a lot is sort of the church shopping phenomenon and kind of American Protestantism, where the focus is very much on individual salvation, and you're free to go wherever you need to go to get it. So it's not really a communal experience, but a kind of an individual, my personal relationship with God. And then the other form, and the term spiritual but not religious is a great way of not having a spiritual community, but having it be about, or a religious community, structured community, but to have it be about one's personal path. I'd say none of this is entirely bad, but it has a flavoring to this American pattern. So I just want to name it as such, that's the way spirituality is going to play out in our American culture if we're not very conscious about this pattern. So let's take another break for just a couple minutes, and we'll turn to one another again for a minute. And the question I'm going to ask this time is there are a couple questions. You can pick one. One is, what basic wound motivates you? I mentioned the one that comes to me most often is power, or the fear of being taken advantage of, so the wanting to be in control. What is it for you? Or another way of saying it is what prevents you from being vulnerable? What's the spot where you find that you check out? Or you could say, what is the thing that makes you feel safe in this kind of reflexive way? If a fear comes up, where do you, instead of experiencing reality in the moment, where do you turn yourself to? So we'll take a minute each and just share. So we've been talking a bit about vulnerability and this paradox of our inherent resistance to it that we all have. And now it's time to turn to the question of unconditioned happiness, unconditional happiness, which is the other side of vulnerability, why it's worth it. And the great paradox is that trying to fix or to overcome or to kill or to destroy or to somehow eliminate that, what I've been calling the fabricated self or the egoic self, only makes it stronger, because the agenda to do that, to try and change it, is itself another game of that same system. So it's saying, if only I could get rid of my ego, then I will be at peace. Whose idea is that? So the paradox is it's in acceptance, or it's in letting go or letting be of ourselves exactly as we are, that the opportunity for being different spontaneously emerges. Some people say that one of the main purposes of spiritual practices is just to exhaust yourself with the effort till you finally give up and just fall into grace. I think there's something to it. There's other places where it seems very necessary, but it's precisely our weakness and our surrender that allows that freedom, that allows it to emerge in a new way. And so that fabricated self has to fail. It's just, if we were able to plan and to plot and to make it happen, then we would still be in the midst of that system. So it has to fail in some way. And interestingly enough, our spiritual failings are often a natural part of this process, because if we begin the spiritual journey, almost always, even if there's a real, and there always is some real invitation from grace or from God or from the transcendent to take up a practice, it's always, our mixed motivation is always going to come in there on some way. And so we always have some agenda that's going to try and use spirituality to make ourselves feel stronger, or make ourselves feel loved, or make ourselves feel accepted, or whatever. And then at some point that motivation is going to break down. So we're going to have spiritual failure. One might say that the spiritual journey is a series of ever greater humiliations of that fabricated self on that side, and ever increasing liberation of that which is beyond and unconditioned.
Could you say that again?
So the spiritual journey, one way to look at it would be a series of ever greater humiliations of our fabricated self. Again, highly un-American idea. But the good news is what comes when that fails is unconditional happiness. Happiness that is not dependent upon conditions, that we don't need to get our way in order to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel accepted, and the ultimate, or the deeper level of to actually know the reality of who we are, truly are, our true nature. So, the 12-step program actually is very clear about this. Step one is that to admit that you are powerless before the disease, and in the bigger picture, it's not alcoholism, it's this human condition that we're talking about. We all have this. So sometimes if you're lucky enough, it might manifest as alcoholism, and then you can get in a very structured program that has thought very clearly. And there's many a drunk who has said that my alcoholism is the best thing that's happened to me because it's brought me to that point of powerlessness. Whereas if the way it manifests is as money-making, you can go your entire life and just be encouraged and applauded and lauded in our culture for doing that. And that's, I think, a much more unfortunate condition. So, or if you're a caregiver, people will want to use your pattern and will encourage it ceaselessly without end. If you're a heroin addict, they'll tell you to stop. So there's advantages to failing in particular ways. There you go. So the key point here is that happiness, according to this old system, what I'm calling the first operating system, or the fabricated self, or the old self, the biblical term, interestingly, is the flesh. The flesh doesn't mean the body, it means this sort of our external selves, or our self that's bound in this conditioned habitual response, is that if the right conditions are met, I will be happy, or I'll be okay, or whatever. And of course that never lasts, just because reality is always changing. Reality is impermanent. I mean, things are impermanent. There is a reality that's beyond that. So on the other side, when these things do fail, when there is an opening, there is a happiness that comes that, again, in the Christian tradition, we would call it as coming from the divine self or from the spirit. That part of ourself, again, that is never born, never dies, was here before our birth, remains after, that is united with God, that is transcendent. That when we open to that the term for a human being that's living from that in the Christian tradition, again, in the biblical tradition, is that person, Paul says that person has become a new creation. And that's the tagline for the trips really. That's what we're hoping to evoke. And that's a person who is or a happiness or a way of being in the world that is not dependent on conditions, but is simply dependent on the degree of openness to reality, with a capital R, both transcendent reality and immanent reality. So the infinite, unchanging, and the manifest world as it's appearing moment by moment. And is open to that in each moment. And so that the what I'm calling happiness, or the well-being, comes simply from that degree of openness and non-resistance to reality. We might say that we've ended our war with reality in that case, and trying to shape it according to our demands. So it's a happiness in the midst of all conditions, not a happiness that depends on getting away from all the conditions. Again, to refer to my own tradition, though this is certainly not, has its expression in other traditions as well. Paul calls it the peace that passes understanding. Jesus in one place calls it the peace the world cannot give, and that term, the world, again means our collective confusion, our collective fabricated self. It doesn't mean material reality. Peace the world cannot give. He calls it eternal life, the life that is not bound by time, not bound by change. He also calls it the realm of God, the kingdom of God. It's a baseline reality that is immense, infinite, eternal, of divine presence, of being, of consciousness, of light, of life, of love. And all of those words are limited and are a consolidation that is not, can't quite fully capture that reality. It's a reality that can only be encountered, of course, but that there is an infinite, undifferentiated presence or reality that is part of our common inheritance as a human being, that is where happiness, where well-being, where this unconditional happiness comes from contact with that. Contact is too distant a word. From abiding in that, from abiding as that. And that is in both its transcendent and its immanent manifestations. So it's in our relationship to that present in things, as well as that present beyond all things. That relationship and that reality is always totally unearned. It's a totally free gift. It's, again, a Christian term would be grace. There's nothing we can do to deserve it. There's nothing we can do to not deserve it. There's nothing we can do to manufacture it. There's nothing we can do to undo it. It's just there as a gift, and it has to be a gift, because if it were anything other than a gift, it would be something to strive for, to manipulate, or to try and force ourselves into. So it has to be a free gift. It has to be unconditional. I thought of using the term unconditional love, but I like the term unconditional happiness right now, because even unconditional love, sometimes in our mind when we hear that, we think of love as something that we're doing, rather than this reality that we're becoming. So the image, again, in my tradition of this is the risen Christ who has been crucified, who's fully embraced the woundedness of the world, and the risen Christ, the image of the risen Christ, is completely radiant, no longer bound in time and space in the same way, but yet the what they call the spiritualized body still bears the wounds. This is the important thing, is that the wounds are still there, the holes are still there, the marks are still there. So there's a teaching there that it's not about, even in what we might call enlightenment or even divine union, there's not a shedding of being human. As long as we're in this body, we're going to also share in this human condition in some extent, although in a radically transformed way. It can't be stored, is another way of saying that. It has to be received anew at every moment. And that's very important because we can have a very powerful spiritual experience, and then in the next moment, if we're trying to go back to and to obtain that experience, we're actually no longer open to divine reality. We're not open to the reality of the moment. We're trying to grasp that experience, which has then become an object in our consciousness. And then we're in the same cycle of possession and violence that we were in before. So even those spiritual experiences or images, it's great to receive them, it's great to be thankful for them, but what I'm calling unconditional happiness is being open to what is given to us in every moment. If you have to think of your past spiritual experience to be happy, that's not unconditional happiness. That's you're happy because something good happened to you. So this is an important distinction. So it's not an experience to remember. And so the spiritual practice that goes along with this, first of all, is there's, in a certain sense, there's a beginning anew every day, and in fact every instant. One of my favorite historical teachers was Anthony of Egypt, who was a desert hermit in the 4th century, and he would say that you have to begin each day as if you were beginning the spiritual journey for the first time. And I think this is the point, because the moment you're not opening up in the exact present moment to reality, but you're making it about something that had happened in the past, you've stopped being open to this, what I'm calling unconditional happiness, so this reality, and you're turning it into something to protect yourself from or distance yourself from reality in the moment. So there's one aspect of this means is that there's a total equality of the spirit. It means that we're all being invited to be naked and open to life and to God and to reality moment by moment. Paradoxically, when I say that, it also means being open to our resistance to reality. So the paradox is you don't, you can say yes even as you're feeling resistance, and you're saying yes to accepting that feeling of resistance. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's a very important distinction, because otherwise this can seem like it's something unattainable. And the good news for that is that means that if you just started meditating, or if you just started trying to pray today, you're in just as good a position as somebody who's been doing it for 80 years, because the practice is moment by moment to open to reality. And on this perspective, it doesn't matter that much where you are on some process or some journey, so much as it is that in the moment you are opening. That's your only job, if we're to call it a job or a task. So it's not an end point, but a state of relationship with what is, and that's what makes it liberating. The Christian way of saying this is that it's heaven all the way to heaven. Heaven's not somewhere you get to. It's the moment you're open, you're already there, and that continues to unfold. The other paradox about this that I want to emphasize, as we've been talking about vulnerability, is that our failures are often the best teachers into this openness, far more than our successes. Again, Paul in the New Testament says that he had prayed about a weakness that he had, and God had said to him, can find it here. This happened 2,000 years ago and things haven't changed a bit. So it says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And he goes on to say, I would rather boast most gladly of my weakness in order that the power of Christ, meaning this divine human unity, may dwell with me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and constraints for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Perfect summation of that principle. So it's our being broken open, it's our loss, it's our falling apart that makes us realize that there's nothing that we could have ever done to obtain this, and it's a free gift anyways. It's the same thing as saying that you have to become like a little child to enter the kingdom of heaven. So, so in a moment we're going to shift to the question of radical social change. Because what happens if we take that seriously? What does that mean for our world? But before we do that, we'll take one last break, and I'll ring the bell. I will ring the bell in the middle, and I'll try and be clear about enunciating that it's time to switch. People, the question here, or the invitation, is to share two ways to say this. One is to share a time when a great failure led to a new connection to life, either in the moment or in the aftermath. And the second question would be to say just a time when you experienced unconditional happiness. That sense of joy that didn't come from getting what you wanted, but was just there as a gift. So we'll again take just a quick minute each, and I think this time we'll just sit back down because we're let our knees endure the last little sprint to the end. So what would happen? Take a moment to think, what would happen to the world if this was the stance that we engaged with the world? This open-hearted embrace of life, vulnerable, not exerting energy to hide or to flee from any part of ourself or any part of life. That our happiness came moment by moment from our contact with reality rather than from something that we were able to obtain. I think that this is the heart of radical change, radical social change. And the word radical comes from the Latin word radix, the root. So it means change that's coming from the root. So we fulfilled Thoreau's quote of striking at the root, or at least touching upon it here. And it's to be contrasted with extreme change. And extreme comes from the extremity, from something that's on the surface or something away from the center. And so we're not talking about extremism here, we're talking about being radical, going back to the heart, back to the root. And first off, I would say that this state of vulnerability and of this opening to reality and the unconditional happiness that is possible from that, and it is the inevitable consequence of opening fully to reality, totally undercuts the driving forces that are behind the engines of greed, consumption, militarism, and any other, the myriad numbers of sort of collective fear and insanity that are at the root of our great global problems. Underneath it are individual, group, familial, tribal, national, emotional programs for happiness run amok. We're all scared, we're all trying to feel safe. We're all doing it in a way that can't possibly work. And we're colliding with each other, and we're colliding with Earth, and we're colliding with the laws of physics. So this is very, very powerful place to start. When we see these programs and motivations within ourselves, when we're honest, when we see them within the world without judging, without hating, without resisting, and then are able to, from that place of opening to the unconditioned happiness, or unconditional happiness, are able to act from that, what I would call the life of the spirit, or from that place of spacious awareness. Or, this is an important distinction, or spirit-infused and informed principles. And the reason I want to make that distinction is because I can't, nor do does anyone I know, including the most profound spiritual teachers I've ever known, have the capacity to live at every instant in that full awareness. But from that awareness, you can base principles, true principles of action that are informed and infused by that spirit of compassion. And even in moments when you're not totally clear, you can act from them. So one very important skill to use in trying to bring about social change would be to say that I'm not going to make decisions when I'm dominated by this sense of separation and fear. I'm going to make my decisions when there's a place of opening to this unconditioned happiness, in a place of truth, and then I'm going to make them into a policy and follow them out in the times, in the storms, in the times of fear. Because of course it happens plenty. The last couple weeks I've had a couple different instances of people that were very, very angry with me, and I felt a great deal of anger in response, and so it was a practice to not do anything about it, to not write that email, or to write something and not hit send. While that drama is going on, until there's stillness, until there's a place of rest to act from. And sometimes it can be a long time, for me at least. There's a couple images I want to share. Both are from India, but one is from the Bhagavad Gita. It's the image of Krishna, Arjuna, the great hero who has managed to have the great deity Krishna guiding his chariot, driving his chariot, and he's coming to the edge of this war, this battle where life and fate has brought him, where he has to fight against relatives and kin and friends, and it's this horrible battle. There's going to be slaughter, and he doesn't want to do it. And regardless of what we might think about war, within the context of the story, Krishna's instructions to him are to dive into the heat of the battle, but to keep your heart at the lotus feet of the Lord. It's a marvelous image for the action, the social action coming from this place, to keep our heart open to this true source of life that's not conditioned, however we may know it, and then to dive into action. And that we're acting with love, but total abandonment of results. The Bhagavad Gita, another phrase it says, abandon all attachment to the fruits of your action. So you do the action because it's what love and truth asks you, not because it's going to be successful. I mean, there's some thought that we put into it, but it's not strategizing in the same way. Mother Teresa, again from India, used to say, when somebody asked her, how can you keep doing what you're doing? How can you keep picking up one dying child in the gutters when you know that for every one you pick up, there's 10 more that die that you never touched? And she just paused for a moment, and she thought, and she looked at the interviewer and said, God has never asked me to be successful. God has asked me to be faithful. So I'm going to be faithful to what was mine to do, and I'm not going to worry about the success. So that's, I think how we can go into this. So the question is not what's going to work. I mean, we do have to ask the question somewhat, but ultimately the question is, what does love ask next? Love with a capital L, or what is the next right thing to do? And I find what is so liberating about taking this seriously is that ultimately, and I think this is very important in the type of work that is going on here at the center, is ultimately we do not have to orchestrate the salvation of the world. We don't. Because that always ends up being the biggest and the juiciest project of that fabricated self. Is that I or my people or my groups of people together, like, we're going to do this. We're going to save the world. Not our job. It really isn't. It is our job to, because let me just phrase it again, what that ends up coming out is a very sophisticated version of, if I get this, I'm going to be happy. If we accomplish such and such, if we stop global warming, then all beings will be happy and I'll be happy. Or if we if we stop nuclear war, or whatever, like it's still that same conditioned response. It's subtle because it's such a good thing. Of course we want these things for the world. Very natural. But the source of all being, that source of unconditioned happiness or unconditioned love, unconditioned life, boundless life, that spacious awareness, that infinite consciousness, however we want to say it, is itself, and however we know it, is itself orchestrating the healing and redemption of all the world. And so our one and only job, or one or only thing that life needs from us, is for us to open our hearts fully to be guided in playing our particular part in the dance. That's the only thing that's asked of us, and it's the best thing that we can give. So we each are an absolutely necessary instrument in the orchestra, but we're not the conductor. Or we might say that we're an absolutely necessary strand in the web or the tapestry of life, but we're not the weaver. So this is extremely important, I think, because if we try to take up that role, we may come to a very different conclusion than if we make our practice of listening deeply and carefully and closely within for that which is ours to do. And that's that, if you look at classic cultures that understood this, that did things like vision fasting, somebody would be sent away from the community to listen, not for the answer of how to fix things, but to cry for their own vision and for their own message. And the understanding is that if each person did that, the unfolding of the community would happen as it needed to, because there was something greater than the community itself that was holding the community, that was guiding that movement. And my experience in leading fasts for people and leading people going out into the wilderness is that is always true. People receive what they need in a way that's much bigger than anything that I could ever manufacture. I don't need to, I just need to try and support people and then get the heck out of the way to allow that to happen. And I think that that's true on many more levels than we can possibly imagine. And the other thing that's about that is that if the question we're asking is, where does our deepest being and our deepest joy and the world's deepest need meet, and we're moving from that place, we are already, again I'll use this classic Christian term, we are already saved, in the sense that we are already coming from a place of wholeness, and we are simply playing out our wholeness in the midst of a broken world. We're not trying to fix the world, we are manifesting and expressing our wholeness in the midst of the world's brokenness. And that just so happens to be the most effective way to facilitate wholeness in the world as well. And it's a heck of a lot more fun. Because you don't have to wait for the whole rest of the world to become whole, to be living in and abiding in an experience of wholeness yourself in the midst of the brokenness. Exactly. Hallelujah. So it's so important that we do that. I think this is how we can participate in the transformation of the world. And I think that's our work that draws us together here. So, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes before 9, and we also, I often guard my time jealously around this kind of thing. So we started about 15 or 20 minutes late, so if anyone wants to stay, I'll stay right here. And that time afterwards, if anyone has to leave at 9, please feel free to, but I'd like to open it up to other people's thoughts and reflections.
I just wanted to say what you were just saying at the very end was reminding me. I just recently started studying Buddhism pretty intensively and trying to figure out, just trying to find my way on the path. And what you had said about not looking at success, but looking at the path. It sort of goes along with the whole right action, right speech. That the idea of living, I guess, to the benefit of yourself and the world as opposed to a detriment. And I recently got involved with a group, and in doing the, oh my God, we got to fix this whole problem thing, became totally overwhelmed and was like, I can't deal with this anymore. And just in this discussion, I was like, I don't have to feel like I need to solve the problem. I can get back in. And it's an organization started by Larry Lessig that's called Root Strikers. And it's about campaign fundraising reform, but it's, and so it's very inspirational to now feel like, hey, I don't have to, the solution is not the issue, it's the action,
Yeah.
And thank you.
I just started reading Denise Ray's book, The Seed Underground, about seed saving, and it starts with a chapter about our very own near and dear Sylvia Davitz, who lives in Upper Valley. And she has this wonderful quote in there that, I don't know if this is her quote or she's quoting someone else, but Sylvia says, she's talking about the systems of the world and the, sort of the evils of the modern system, including genetic engineering and everything else. And she says, our job is not to change the system. Our job is to live in such a way and teach in such a way that makes the system irrelevant. And I think that's, it speaks a lot to what you're talking about, and in a different way.
Yeah.
So.
What you said at the end about the broken world, I feel like we're in this time where brokenness is normal.
Yes.
We don't even know what wholeness is
Yeah.
like. And so I feel like those of us on the path, the more we can sit and circle and feel into it in a felt
Yes.
sense, and really bringing it in from bigger than us,
Yeah.
the imminent. So I did that a few weeks ago with a circle, and then I had like at 3 a.m. wrote this beautiful thing about when love breaks through, and I had this complete vision of what the world would be like. It was all based in love. Like, we don't need homeless shelters, we don't need hunger services. All this stuff just goes away completely, that we're all running around.
Yeah.
All the what was it, the leaves versus the root.
Yeah.
But we need to feel. You're like in a felt vision
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Because we're really busy right
Yeah.
At least the world I work in of
No,
social change, people are knocking themselves out and they're not really at the root.
Absolutely, and it's not to say that, in moment by moment, many of those things are necessary too. It's not to denigrate any of them, but yeah, I think when you're mentioning the vision too, something that I mentioned, vision fast, it's amazing how many movements have come in dreams or in vision times or in these sort of liminal spaces, where we're not in control, and then couldn't have even dreamed it up, but it comes to us.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot more of those interests in this experiment, being in that space a lot more.
Yes, yeah, I think you're right.
Experientially.
Yeah.
As they say in ancient culture, the mind was a tool, not the driver.
Yes.
In our culture, the mind is the driver.
Yes.
So, it's how does it become a tool for take a step back, so we're in those spaces more where the journey with the vision comes through, and then the mind can help us plan and get there.
Yes.
Yeah, we agree.
but it has a backseat role.
Yeah, I mean, you need the mind to measure the lumber and calculate it.
Absolutely.
Stay up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, all for it there.
Yeah. But yeah, it's different.
It's different, right?
I especially appreciated your reference to the global phenomenon and sometimes making reference to what is specifically American about these very important issues. Can you say something to the extent of harmonization? Is it a different language? Does something need to happen for us to kind of globally experience the potential that is in crisis? And how much, verbal language, different languages, or even just ideas, concepts, how they translate, and there's a drifting that happens in languages. And I think that eventually helps us to come back to root, because it's all, it used to be one vowel,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
then it kind of all fell apart. But what is going on with this tectonic shifts of how, was that, is,
Yeah, that's a lot of great questions and thoughts there. I guess one thing that comes to my mind is that I think when each person or each community, to the extent that we're living, from the depths, there is that experience of this transcendent presence that also brings with it an experience of unity with other people, and that transcends cultures, or this transcends particulars. And I think to the extent that is, the more deeply that's felt, the more natural there's a harmonization between cultures. And what I've seen is that when that's not there, and there's a conflict, it's very difficult to negotiate on the level of the mind and the ideas to a place of harmony. You can negotiate a truce or a ceasefire, but to actually negotiate harmony, it seems like there has to be, at least on one side, a willingness to be in the place interiorly where there's a sense of unity.
and that actually transcends language.
Yes,
because
that's right. Yeah.
That's so much happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah. And I think it ties into what we're saying about vulnerability too, because we have less control when we're engaging with someone that we don't understand as well across cultures, and especially when there's been historic deep wounding. For example, in the Middle East, this tremendous conflict that goes back generations and many, many wounds. There's not going to be peace there without being vulnerable and feeling, that pain and mourning and the flip side example that comes to mind to me is in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that they've done to try and bring about some being present to the woundedness that happened in apartheid, and they've not totally eliminated strife, but they've certainly done I think a marvelous job compared to what could have happened.
Yeah, the Hutu and Tutsi conflict is doing that too.
Right now.
People facing,
Yeah.
But it's the awareness of the people that live in the country. Because there was a YouTube video with someone from Israel, I think, saying, hey, I don't hate this other country.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
and if the leaders have an issue, they should fix their issue, not send us to hate you. And
Yes.
they actually got a YouTube video back from that country saying, we don't hate you either.
Yeah.
We send you love, so.
Yeah. It's beautiful, and I think oftentimes individuals, the people that have less invested, oftentimes have an easier time seeing clearly than people that are in the positions of power where there's such a heavy investment. It's really hard.
The beacon here at the
Yeah. Yeah.
2 days ago, I was in the, the heart of the, what I call the heart of the beast, of the healers. And I was just witnessing, I was in the hospital. I was sitting there at the hospital waiting while Patricia was having her in and out operation. And I just saw so many people there, not just the people coming in, but the people that were, there to help the people coming in that were so numbed out. Most of it I could see was with food. But having, being an addiction counselor, I could see, and then the next day we had this thing with the documentary, Hungry Hearts. And there were some of the primary pill popper givers, the doctors and the doctors-to-be and the social workers and then some of the people that, the parents, the kids that are wiped out on pain pills were sitting there taking in, the primary source material of the people giving the rap afterwards, say, after the documentary. Because some of them were real right there. Here's the people, here's the doc that was there. And it finally dawned on me that, the connections and all this. And I had to get vulnerable because I had to stand right up and put my hand up and, I waved my little book I'm reading, The Hungry Ghosts, which is a Buddhist thing, and your soul gets, but it's the best thing that's ever been written about addiction. And I had to say that, did you know that 80% of the painkillers in the world are consumed by 5% of the population of the world, i.e. us? And do you know that 80% of the heroin addicts shifted from the painkillers in this country too? And then I just saw that, all these, they're just, that's one particular drug besides alcohol that numbs you out. And so for young people now, they're getting numbed out even more and then how are you going to be working with people that are, just so, it's like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. They're so pushing in food, pushing in pills, and trying to be in denial, oblivious about what our actions are doing. So the question I had there, I said, do you all know that you're the gatekeepers? You're the people that, gave Patricia 20 Vicodin, and she didn't need any of them? And then now, what is she going to do with them? It wasn't until afterwards, people were doing this, but then afterwards the docs came up and, everybody, I'm glad you said that, I'm glad you, came up with it, but it was just like, you had to just let go and just say what was the truth. And not pussyfoot around. Why did they do this, or why, there's all these interesting intellectual questions.
Always about them.
But that's that level of taking in a peaceful spot, because on one level I had to really chill out to be able to get out what I needed to say in a very distilled way. But then I really had to say something because, wow, here we were right in the middle of the temple when these characters are giving out stuff that are numbing us out left and right, so we're not even allowed to feel the suffering, let alone do something about it. It's just like, this isn't okay.
I'm glad you
Well, it was
said
great,
that.
because at the end, doctors came up, they introduced themselves, they said, they got to get out there and tell their colleagues about it, and then wannabe doctors, the med students, said they want to, meet and talk, and they're going to meet me, at one of the schools they work at, so I thought, just saying it, just letting it out, and then just going back, and then just see what happens. But that's putting a lot of that
That's a great
together,
example.
and allowing what the Sufis call the unseen rain, what we call grace.
Unseen rain, I like that. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Does seem like a almost logical result or consequence of a culture that is, as you were saying, addicted to this idea of solving things with our external environment, creating happiness from, if this, then that, because in an economic system where you always have to constantly grow the economy, when people are trying to solve their problems and make themselves happy with external means, naturally it's a billion-dollar business. And so there's one facet of that billion-dollar business just happens to be chemical. The other facets are automobiles with fancy bodies and fancy clothes and all these other things that we put on as fixes. It's all the same addiction, as you're saying. It's just being satisfied with different forms that are all not really working.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think when I didn't talk too much during the talk about the idea of collapse, or that that there's an inevitable shift coming with limited resources. But if we assume that that's coming, say within certainly within a century, if not decade, that the culture is continuing to amp up all these chemical forms, TV, entertainment, all these extra more and more, and the response to the fear of seeing that it might all be falling apart is to try and do more of it, and more and more. And I think it's so important, and I'm so encouraged by these grassroots movements and by the work of the center and places that are taking this serious look at our spiritual relationship to all of these things, because I think that we're going to be needed. Like this perspective is going to be very needed when it comes to a point when that when it's just not possible to numb out or to purchase out or to like there will come a point, I don't know when it's going to come, but where that's not possible. And the more people that have understanding like this that can be involved in that transition, the better it's going to go, in my opinion.
Repent the end is
Yeah.
It's funny.
And of course, that word repent in the Greek means change your consciousness, essentially, change your awareness. Go beyond your ordinary mind.
This was the first time during this talk that I thought about, as you were saying, the need for people to become vulnerable and to just kind of fall apart before good can come, and thinking about collapse and all of the various calamities that can happen, landslides or this or that. It just occurred to me, like, what if people first have to go through a serious mental collapse and change their kinds of cushion from all the ways that we pad ourselves out in the world to avoid this impending doom, and to really be able to get on our meditation cushions or whatever it is, change the way that we're able to interface with the physical impending doom that's actually going to happen. Like, I had always thought of it before as people will wake up when they have to, because the environment will provide the platform for the spiritual change or the mental change. But wouldn't it be cool if it was the other way around?
Yeah.
And that then from that informed place, we could transcend to the unknown, for the physical reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the first time I thought of it that way.
Yeah, and I mean that's certainly my great hope that could be.
Maybe some of those big failures you talked about will be things like Arizona trying to vote in new laws to curtail, rights for gays or whatever crazy things you're hearing about, strengthening laws in Africa against gays and all this. Feels like the old paradigm is pulling as hard as possible at this end of the elastic band, and the people that are kind of in a new paradigm are pulling at this end of the elastic band. And that gets back to the ego kind of that you talked about not being helpful, but maybe on both ends of the elastic band we can have more failures because of that tension. And maybe those failures really are the ground of you know, a new way of seeing things and letting go of that elastic finally. Letting it snap.
It certainly can be, yeah.
If each of us would do whatever action, like you said, detached and to be like, may the highest good come out of this.
Yes.
And I tried, I'm drawn with my heart.
Yeah.
And if it's a failure, maybe it's good to be a failure,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And anything you, like vulnerability seems to be a little bit connected to attachment. Because let's say you purchase a vehicle because you got to travel around, and you're kind of attached to that, but then you got to open to be vulnerable because, you know, someone might crash it.
Yeah.
And many other aspects in life are similar.
Yeah, I do think. Yeah. Did you go?
Oh, me?
Yeah. Did you have
Oh,
something?
I was just thinking about the idea of community and how, like 50 years ago, mobility was so limited because we didn't just, like today I got my car, I came from Reading, like 70 years ago, that would have never happened, you know, just go to White River on a whim.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
the community was limited by space and it was also limited by technology, you could only call. And now, like, I can be so individual, it's almost hurting me because I'm not aware of everybody else, and I'm only aware of myself and my problems, and so we don't keep an eye on each other anymore, because, like, Reading is cool because it's so small, like, we all kind of are keeping each other in the peripherals, and that keeps our vulnerabilities very out in the open, so people are aware of it, and, like, but at the same time, it gives us strength because, you know, if I ever need anything, somebody's going to be there for me no matter what.
Yeah.
But that sense of community is kind of like where I go, I don't have a really strong sense of community unless I'm forming it, and I think people are starting to search for that.
Yeah.
And I think the internet is an awesome tool for that because, like, I've always like didn't like it, but now I'm like, wow, like people are like searching for it, man. Like I'm finding all these channels of people, like you find out about this via the internet. Like that's how I found it. Like finding that ability to have a community that's not like limited by place, and that's really cool. Like Lena was talking about.
Yeah.
I think that like it's being found, which is really cool. Like, the draw to the light is just cool again.
Yeah.
And it'll be alright. Like,
Yeah.
it reminds me of like
Absolutely.
Irene when it happened and how terrible and how beautiful it was. Like a demonstration of humanity at its very like best. Like that gives me a huge faith in humanity.
Yeah.
Like no matter who you are, and if you were an addict or me or my neighbor with an excavator, everybody came out and just was like, okay.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you know,
It's,
all that other stuff fell away in that
Yeah.
moment. So.
it's a beautiful thing, and it's a great example of how we don't necessarily know what's going to come from one event. we do our right action, but sometimes a tragedy can be a chance for great healing.